Ever wonder how a single city starting as basically a muddy market town could end up dominating the entire ancient world? How's that even happen? Well, today we're jumping right into the incredible first chapter of that story, the unlikely, brutal, and brilliant rise of Rome, from a humble village to the undisputed master of the Italian peninsula. It's a wild ride. Let's get into it. Okay, so first things first, you gotta understand the world Rome was born into. See, the Eastern Mediterranean, that was the old world, ancient, established empires. But the West, the world you're looking at here, was a totally different beast. It was a frontier. Think of it like the Wild West, a volatile, dynamic place with no huge empires, no massive cities. It was basically a world up for grabs. And that right there is the big question, isn't it? Out of all the different peoples and powers fighting for a piece of this region, how did one small, frankly insignificant Latin village manage to conquer not just its neighbors, but eventually this whole world? The answer, well, it's an incredible lesson in resilience, adaptation, and sheer ambition. So, where do we start? Well, funny enough, the story doesn't really begin with the people. It begins with the land itself. You could say the very geography of the Italian peninsula gave Rome its first major leg up. Think about Greece, right? Super mountainous, rugged. That kind of pushes people to the sea, to become sailors and traders, forming little city-states. But Italy? It's different. It's blessed with these wide, fertile plains. Perfect for farming, perfect for raising livestock. And what does that mean? It means you can support a huge, growing population. So right from the get-go, Rome's destiny was tied to the land. They became farmers and soldiers who expanded on foot, not by ship. But here's the catch. This awesome land of opportunity, it wasn't empty, not by a long shot. It was already crowded. Before Rome could even dream of being a big deal, it had to face three major players who already dominated the peninsula. All right, first up, to the north of Rome, you had the Etruscans. These guys were, well, they were a bit of a mystery. We're still not totally sure where they came from, but by 1000 BC, they were here in Italy, and they were a force to be reckoned with. They were amazing seafarers and pretty much controlled the whole west coast, which basically put Little Rome in a box. And make no mistake, these were not some simple barbarians. Just look at this. This incredible bronze chariot tells you everything you need to know about their culture. The artistry, the metalworking skill, it was just leagues ahead of what the early Romans were doing. The Etruscans were the sophisticated, advanced neighbors who would become Rome's first teachers. And, as we'll see, its first master. Okay, rival number two, Carthage. Now, Carthage started as a Phoenician colony over on the coast of Africa, but it grew into an absolute powerhouse. It was the leading commercial and naval power in the entire Western Mediterranean. Their ships were everywhere, their wealth was legendary, they were the undisputed titans of trade. And last, but certainly not least, you had the Greeks. By the 8th century BC, they'd set up shop all across southern Italy and Sicily, creating this whole network of powerful, super civilized city-states. I mean, the area was so Greek, it was literally called Magna Graecia, Great Greece. They brought philosophy, art, advanced warfare, a whole world of culture just sitting there to Rome's south. So let's recap. You've got these three huge powers: the mysterious Etruscans, the super-rich Carthaginians, and the highly civilized Greeks. And then there's Rome. And, well, let's just say its beginnings were a little more humble. Yeah, forget everything you picture when you think of Rome. No marble temples, no grand forums. Around 1000 BC, the spot that would one day be Rome was basically just a trading post on the Tiber River. A simple, open-air market. The Forum. It's where local Latin farmers would come to trade their grain and cattle for stuff from those fancy Etruscan merchants from the north. That's it. A market. Then, around 750 BC, things changed. The Etruscans decided they'd rather rule than trade. They conquered the little village of Rome, and for the next 250 years, Rome was run by Etruscan kings. Now, this was a really crucial period. You can think of it like a long apprenticeship. The Romans learned a ton about art, architecture, and how to run a government. But the Etruscan kings were also tyrants. And around 500 BC, the Latin people decided they'd had enough. They revolted, kicked out the king, and created their very own state, the Roman Republic. But just because they were free from the Etruscans didn't mean everything was perfect. Nope. Before Rome could even think about conquering Italy, it had a much bigger problem to solve. It had to conquer itself. You see, the early republic was split right down the middle. On one side, you had the patricians. These were the nobles, the wealthy families. They controlled everything, the government, the army, all of it. And on the other side, you had the plebs, the common people. They were the farmers, the soldiers, but they had basically zero say in the state they were expected to fight and die for. Now, what happens next is one of the absolute keys to understanding Rome's success. Instead of tearing themselves apart in a bloody civil war, the plebs fought back, smartly. Through protest and negotiation over 2 centuries, they just slowly, methodically won their rights. It was amazing. First, they got their own officials, the tribunes, who could veto unfair laws. Then, they demanded the laws be written down for everyone to see, the famous 12 tables. And finally, they got the ultimate prize, the right to make laws and hold any office in the state. And this is so important. This long, peaceful struggle created this incredibly resilient society where every single citizen felt like they had a real stake in its survival. And this right here is just a perfect example of that practical Roman mindset. You know, as society got more complicated, trading with actual cows got, well, pretty inconvenient. So they started making these copper blocks. Now, the Latin word for cattle was picus, which led to their word for property, pecunia. Sound familiar? That's exactly where we get our word pecuniary. I just love that. It's a tangible line from cattle to cash, a sign of a society really getting organized. But here's the really smart part. Even as the common people gained all this power, they were wise enough to leave the big picture stuff, the day-to-day running of the state, to the people with the most experience, the Senate. This council of former officials and elder statesmen became the steady hand on the rudder, guiding Rome through some seriously treacherous waters ahead. Okay, so now their internal house is finally in order. Rome is united, and so they turned their gaze outward. What comes next is a brutal 200-year fight for survival, a fight that would end with the mastery of all of Italy. And the start of this new chapter was almost the end of the whole story, a disaster. Barbarian Gauls swept down from the north, completely smashed the Roman army, and sacked the city, burned it to the ground. The Romans barely held out on the fortified Capitoline Hill. It was an absolute catastrophe, a blow that taught them a lesson they'd never forget. They immediately built their first huge defensive walls and swore they would never, ever be that vulnerable again. Now, take a look at this map. It really shows you how dicey their situation was. Even after 100 years as a republic, around 400 BC, Rome is still just that tiny little smudge of territory around the city. They're a nobody, a local power surrounded by enemies. Honestly, their story could have just flickered out right here. But over the next 100 years, everything changes. After finally getting control of their immediate neighbors, Rome went up against its biggest challenge yet. A long, brutal, generation-spanning war with the fierce Samnite tribes up in the mountains. By 290 BC, Rome had won. And look at the map now. Wow, they control nearly all of central Italy. The little city-state is gone. This is a real regional power. The final piece of the puzzle came from the Greeks in the south. They got pretty nervous about Rome's expansion, so they called in the big guns, Pyrrhus, a brilliant king and general from mainland Greece. And Pyrrhus, with his war elephants, actually beat the Romans twice. But his victories cost him so many men that to this day, we call a victory that's not worth the price a Pyrrhic victory. In the end, Rome's relentless, grinding determination just wore him down. He left, the Greek cities gave in, and by 275 BC, it was over. The conquest was complete. Rome was the master of Italy. So think about that. In just over 200 years, Rome went from a tiny republic on the brink of collapse to the ruler of an entire peninsula. The Etruscans were gone, the Greeks were subdued, the board was being cleared, the Western Mediterranean was about to have a new main character. And this sets up the ultimate showdown. With all of Italy under its command, Rome looks across the sea and sees the only other major power left in the West, the massive commercial empire of Carthage. There just wasn't room for both of them. The struggle for Italy was finished, but the fight for the entire world, that was just getting started.